A reading from the book of Esther, chapter 2. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appointed commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because of Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle, Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. She continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of Annals in the presence of the king. This is God's word.
Good morning. Happy New Year. Oh boy, January already. I won't even ask you to say it again. But after listening to that, anybody who says the Bible's a boring book has clearly never read it, because it's filled with these kinds of strange stories. And we're jumping into this one over the next 4 weeks, as Drew mentioned, and it's consistent with what we've been doing since just after Labor Day, in which we have been looking, and we'll look through the 4th of July on the general theme of story as a way to try to help us deal with the disruption and the massive disorientation that we've been through over the last several years, and frankly, to help us navigate really the uncertainty both locally and globally that faces us over the next coming year. How do we do that as those, just as citizens of the city, but also in particular followers of Jesus? And so we're doing it the way the people of God have always done it, and you can look back to Deuteronomy, we talked about this. They immersed themselves over and over and over again in this strange and ancient story of God. the remembering what the Bible was about. And it's a story, as you've heard here, that doesn't ignore the kind of ethical and social and cultural thorny issues that affect us, but the Bible doesn't get caught up in the kind of polarizing and narrow streams that have preoccupied the public square and frankly have paralyzed the church over the last couple of years as we have viewed a lot of these thorny issues through conservative and progressive lenses. The Bible will not allow us to do that. And so that's why we're looking at story. And even for those of you who are here or maybe listening in online that don't identify yourself as a Christian, you're kind of kicking the tires around the Bible, this is not a religious thing. That to be human is to find some kind of story or stories out of which you're trying to make sense of your life. Nobody can make sense of their lives without some kind of story. You may not know the one that you're living out of, but as Joan Didion says, humans tell themselves stories in order to live. We wake up in the morning, we tell ourselves stories to try to make sense of the headlines that confront us in the morning and the dreams that have haunted us at night. You can't make sense of them unless you have some kind of story, which brings us to the strange story of Esther. Now, Esther found herself in this world that was very different than the one of her ancestors. She was dragged away as a slave by Nebuchadnezzar. She was living hundreds and hundreds of miles from the story that her cousin Mordecai, I'm sure, was telling her. And now the Persian Empire had taken over the Babylonian reign. And so the story of Esther is, how do you figure out what it means to be a person of the Bible in a culture that is radically hostile and alien to your own faith? Certainly can find resonance in that part of the story, right? As this is a community that seeks to follow the sacred call of Jesus to love our neighbors and heal our city. How do you do that in a culture that oftentimes thinks that the teachings of Jesus are crazy in this day and age? And so I would encourage you, just as we start a new year, to, as we always do, read the whole book of Esther. Don't wait week to week to just read these four. It's only 10 chapters. It's only 15 minutes off of Twitter. Take 15 minutes away from Twitter and read the book of Esther and immerse yourself in it. Go into a community group. If you're not part of a community group, most of the community groups are studying what we preach on Sundays. This is a great time to immerse yourself in the story. And in particular, as I was thinking about Esther and at the start of a new year in January, it really fits. I mean, what happens in the church calendar after Advent is Epiphany. And Epiphany is just a fancy way for the church to say, well, who's this Jesus that was born in Bethlehem? What is he really like? And historically, the church has studied his miracles and all the different events in the Gospels. And Esther is a way to help us celebrate that Epiphany in January, because January is what? All the lights are put down, the parties are over, you trudge past the dying Christmas trees on the sidewalk as you make your way to the subway, and your mood is crappy, right? And Esther is a great way to think about Epiphany, because Esther, we've studied Noah and Abraham and Isaac and David, and they were radically flawed human beings, broken human beings, but they're very much like Mount Rushmore characters, right? They kind of crush you with their resume. But Esther is like the rest of us. She's not particularly noble or pious, nor is Mordecai. And in fact, you could read the whole book of Esther, and God's name never comes up once. Nobody prays. There's no mention of the word temple. There's no story of the Exodus. I mean, how did it end up in the Bible? There's very little connection to the Bible. But frankly, isn't that normally how God shows up in our life? It's certainly how he shows up in my life, trudging past dead Christmas trees in the winters of our lives. There's no burning bushes. I've never seen one of those trees turn into a burning bush on my way to the subway and start talking to me. No rivers have ever parted for me. I've never been blinded on the way to work like Paul on the road to Damascus. Those are exceptions to the epiphanies of our lives. And what the book of Esther reminds us is that most of the time, the way we experience the presence of God is usually through his absence, and we look back and say, oh, that's where he was. I see how he wove together all of my brokenness and all of my virtues and all of the Januaries of my life. And he was always there. He was always there. That's the story of Esther. And so today I just want to pull that thread, because I don't know if you noticed the way that Drew was leading us in worship today, how often he mentioned the sovereignty of God, or that sometimes we come into worship and we don't expect God to be here, or you have to imagine him sitting with you, right? This is how God works in our lives. And so I want to look at this thread that we're going to be looking at throughout the book of Esther through some symbols here: 2 banquets and a gate. Sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. 2 Presbyterians and a rabbi walk into a bar, right? There's 2 banquets and a gate that help us understand. They're symbols of the circumstances of our lives where God's absence feels more palpable than his presence. And so let me just show you what I mean. But I'm going to start where it ends, which is the gate. We're going to look at the gate. Then we're going to look at the banquet of Xerxes, which I'll explain because that's chapter 1. Then we're going to look at the banquet of Esther. And then we're going to come back to the gate and help us understand how God works through his absence. So, the gate, verse 19, Mordecai is sitting there at the king's gate. Now, what is the king's gate in the ancient Near East? The king's gate is like Center Street. If you ever got called to jury duty, you take the subway downtown, you get lost, you try to find those buildings, and that's where all the cases are heard. That's where justice is meted out. The king's gate was that place. It's a place where cases were heard in justice. So Mordecai happened to be there, and one explanation as to why he was there was that perhaps when Esther became queen, she assigned her cousin a special place at the king's gate as part of the favors that she was able to dole out. But anyway, he was there, and he overhears this injustice. He overhears this plot that the king is about to be assassinated, and he tells Esther, who tells the king, who gives Mordecai credit, and in the Persian way of being, Mordecai should have been celebrated. Mordecai should have been brought into the gate because he did the right thing at the right place at the right time. And instead, like Joseph in the prison, he's forgotten. He's left behind. He's left outside looking in. And if you know anything about this story, and we got a hint of it in the story, right? They had to hide their ethnicity. Why? Because they were in mortal danger. They were in mortal danger. And so this very act of justice that Mordecai put forth to the king that should have brought him out of danger left his life in danger. And this is my only point as we think about the gate. It's just this small scene that symbolizes the fact, and this was the prayer that we just heard, that the headlines that we're confronted with are oftentimes these overwhelming evils and injustices. You watch a 30-minute news program and 25 minutes of it depresses you, and then there's 45 seconds of some kindness, and then it's the weather, right? Which is also depressing in January. So I said there's not much going on there, but there's so many things that are overwhelming, that are unjust and evil. And they're this close to a Holocaust in the book of Esther. And I just looked up just last night when I was getting ready for this morning, International Justice Mission, which many of you know is a faith-based organization that rescues slaves. Their current estimation is that there are 50 million slaves today in the world, mostly children and women, who generate $150 billion in revenue through private industry. This is the world in which we live. Most people never even make it to the gate, let alone experience it. So it begs the question, right? What kind of world do we live in coming out of Christmas, where we sang Joy to the World? And we talked about that the king has come, and yet we wake up in the morning and we experience these injustices at the gate. And is this the world in which we live? Is Esther just one of those Cinderella fairy tales where the slave girl ends up on the throne, but that never actually really happens in real life? Because this is the question that you have to answer every day when you wake up, whether you're a Christian or not, because it's the only way you're going to trudge past the Christmas trees in January. Which story do you really believe about the world? The one that you sing about here on Sundays, or the one that greets you on your Twitter feed on the rest of the week? And so, to help us immerse ourselves and remember the stories in which we live, even when God seems absent, I just want to look at the two banquets as two ways in which you can answer the question of what kind of world in which do we live? What kind of gate of justice is really there? And is it ever going to really open and let us in? And so to look at the first banquet is the banquet of the king Xerxes. And you have to go back and read chapter 1. But there is this picture of this vast power and wealth, and I'll just read a little bit of it. At the time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne. So this is what I was trying to do. You imagine him on this throne that was like 12 feet above the rest of the people around him, in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials and military leaders of Persia and Media, and for a full 180 days he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty, and then he gave a 7-day banquet. That's quite a party. A 6-month celebration. So here's the picture, right? There's this king on a throne who through military victory had consolidated his empire, and for 6 months had all of his wealth and all of his power and all of his strength just rolling past him on this throne to celebrate it. And then he throws a banquet. And it's as if, to use a metaphor, he's like the creator of this universe, this kingdom, and he's sitting back on his throne, and he's looking at the world in which he's created and said, it is good. It is good. This is the world in which we find ourselves, represented by this banquet of this king. And we know through the historical records of this particular kingdom that their definition of power and wealth and beauty and sex were very different than the ones that are defined in the stories that Esther would have heard growing up, where wealth and power were concentrated among a very privileged few, and there was vast poverty and vast lack of food, where one writer commented it this way: it was a time when men were valued based on the size of their checkbook and women based on the size of their dresses. And I wonder how much progress we've made in 2,500 years. But this was the world in which Xerxes reigned, and that Mordecai and Esther found themselves in. Now, next week, I'm going to dive into the weeds of what the danger of that kind of power and pride yields in our lives. But today, I just wanted to have it as a metaphor for the kind of world that we often feel like we find ourselves in. One is very Darwinian, where the rich get richer, where the justice of the gate is defined by the king who's on the throne. There's this scene in The Last Emperor. Some of you may have seen the movie. It reminded me of this, that the young child who's anointed as the emperor of China lives this kind of magical life of luxury. And he's got 1,000 eunuchs at his command. And his brother asks him, so what happens, brother, when you do something wrong? Because you're the king. What happens when you do something wrong? And he replies this: when I do something wrong, someone else gets punished. And so to demonstrate it, he broke a jar, and then he had one of his servants beaten. This was the world of Xerxes. Xerxes got drunk, and he called his queen, and he wanted to roll her out like a fine bottle of wine or some kind of like jewel. And she said, no, I'm not going to be exploited that way. And what happened? She was banished. Because he's the king. And he gets to decide what justice is. And she had no power, and she was gone. Gone. This is the banquet. This is the world in which there is no God. There is no moral arc of justice, right? One of my favorite explanations of this is Francis Spufford, who's a wonderful British writer. He has this book called Unapologetic, and it's a kind of a raunchy defense of the Christian faith. So I'm just giving you that warning ahead of time. There's some R-rated words in there. But he talks about growing up in London, and there are these slogans on a bus that says, "There's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life." There's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. And as he reflected on that, he said, well, that's not only cruel, but he said it has an emotional logic that is a denial of hope or consolation of any but the most chirpy, squeaky, bubblegummy reading of the human condition. In other words, unless you're invited to the banquet of Xerxes, what it means is if you're sitting there and you see that bus go by and you're in a wheelchair with MS, or on your way home from work to take care of a spouse who has dementia, or you've just been fired from your job because of alcoholism, what that bus slogan means is there's no help coming. You are completely on your own. You're a Persian exile. You're an exile from the Jewish land like Esther and Mordecai, and there is no help coming. That's the world that flows from that banquet. As you trudge past Christmas trees strewn on the sidewalks on a January day, there's no help coming for your anxiety, for your fear, for your relationships. Now, the Christian understands that that's not the way the world works, but frankly, if we're honest, at least in my own life, living in a world that is much more like Esther than Moses in terms of the epiphanies of God, it's so easy to become cynical or discouraged or filled with doubt, or more likely for those of us on the Upper West Side to kind of become a concubine of the Xerxes of the world. And spend much more of our time investing in those kinds of banquets, in our own comfort, in our own wealth, in our own status, than it is to pay attention to the Mordecais or the Esthers of our world. That's more likely the temptation. It's not so much to kind of give in and throw away our faith, but it is giving in and throwing our lives into that kind of world. So that's one answer to the question. What banquet am I living out of? What do I really believe about the world when there is no burning bush in my life? And so that's where we have to come to the second banquet, which we just heard about, and I'll just try to be brief. You see there in verse 18. I won't get into all the American Idol Persian style of how they chose Esther. But in verse 18, she finds favor, and she's thrown a banquet. And there's the same kind of liberality if you read those two side by side. But that word for holiday, see that word for holiday, is literally giving of a rest, which is the word that we get Sabbath from. And so you see there that in the contrast to the first banquet, where the king looked over his creation built on power, status, and wealth, the writer brilliantly gives us another version, another banquet, another kingdom that is built on something very different. This orphaned, exiled slave has now risen to become one of the most influential people in one of the most powerful kingdoms that has ever existed on the face of the earth. And what does this tell us? The weak become strong, an outsider becomes an insider. The humble and the contrite has been exalted to a throne. And as the story unfolds, we'll begin to exert influences through the ordinary circumstances of her life to thwart a Holocaust and to keep the story of God going. And so if you're reading this, for example, in Hebrew, you're beginning to sense, well, maybe there is a different story. Maybe there's a different reality, something that I don't see, that God has put through his language here, hinting at that there may be a different kind of gate, there may be a different kind of feast, there may be a different kind of hope, there may be a moral arc to the universe, because Esther's Jewish name, Hadassah, is translated myrtle, which is a flower, which the prophet Isaiah uses to depict the kind of flower that will one day replace what? The thorns of the wilderness through the forgiveness and the reconciliation of God. In a Sabbath, Isaiah 56, in which those who are on the outside will finally be invited into what? The feast. Will become people and children of the King. And so you can almost, if you're at all alert to the brilliance of the story, you can feel the hair on the back of your neck saying, holy cow, there's something hidden in here. We don't always need a burning bush. We don't always need the parting of the Red Sea. Because maybe God is there. He may not be mentioned anywhere, but his fingerprints are everywhere. Because either this is the most wildest coincidence ever, or God is at work, even if you don't see him, orchestrating his story. See, the author tells us in verses 9, 15, and 17, he uses the word hesed, which is the unfailing love of God. But anytime it's used in the story of God, whether it's Joseph or Daniel, right? Esther found favor, Esther found favor, Esther found favor. Joseph found favor with Pharaoh. Daniel found favor with Nebuchadnezzar. Nehemiah found favor with the Persian king. And every time that shows up, it means God is at work. And even though they are subordinate and have no power in the presence of the Pharaoh or the kings, the king grants them things. The only difference in Esther is God's never mentioned. But it's the same exact thing. It's implied that the only reason that Esther got to the throne is because God wanted her there. God orchestrated the Januaries of her lives to get her into that position. His hand is everywhere in chapter 2. See, there was no way a male Jew was going to ever end up with any kind of authority in the king's court. The only explanation, the only possible way this story was going to end up with a positive outcome is if there was a queen. And look who showed up. Hadassah, a myrtle, shows up in the presence of the thorns of the wilderness of that banquet and changes and thwarts the Holocaust, as we'll see. So that the promise made to Abraham that through this family the whole world would be blessed would come true. And that the world that began in a garden is going to end up in a new Jerusalem with a new gate and a new feast. See, this is the story that we need to immerse ourselves in, to not get trapped into the cynicism or the commercialism or the materialism or the doubt or the fear that so often comes at me when I think that the only world that we live in is the one of the Xerxes banquets. So let me just close with this, because we got to go back to the gate. We'll close at the gate, because that's where we live our lives, right? We need to get up on a Monday morning in January, you need some hope to propel you, do you not? Some sense of purpose, some sense that your story of your life is connected to some greater story. So we come to the gate and we look for something to replace the thorns of our lives. And really what we need at the gate isn't just justice, right? But we need mercy as well. If the thorns of our lives, many of which we have cultivated, are going to be replaced by myrtle, we don't just need the justice of the king, we need the mercy of the king if we're going to have a hope and a future. And so that's what we find. And it struck me as I was reflecting on this just in my own journal, that the way that happens is through prayer and meditation, and primarily through the Psalms. I've been spending a lot of time in the last several years in the Psalms. And as I was thinking about the story of Esther this week and the Psalms are live in this tension at the gate. I'm on the outside looking in. I'm waiting for justice. And I wonder if I have been forgotten by the king. Because 80% of the Psalms, there's some kind of enemy at work on the individual praying them. Sometimes it's an external enemy. They're being chased by the enemy, and they're praying for deliverance. Most of the time, it's an internal enemy, some combination of abandonment or shame or guilt or envy that is overwhelming the soul of the psalmist. And so what you find in most of the Psalms is what? It's the very human response in the foxhole. God, make haste to save me. Hurry up already. Come quickly, Lord, and save me. That's a human response. When you're in pain, you want 911 and you want them there 20 seconds ago, right? But what's remarkable about the Psalms is that in the same breath is, but I wait patiently. So come quickly, relieve my pain, but I sing your praises. I rejoice in you. I'm going to tell the whole world about you. And I know that I'm going to see God in the land of the living. Now that feels supernatural. That does not feel human. You say, well, where do you get that kind of strength? And it can only come if you have a faith immersed in the circumstances of the story of Esther, in which somehow you know that when God seems absent, when you don't see him working in any tangible ways, that he's actually there, that he is present, and you can look back on the story of your life and realize that he's been good. I came across one quote that talked about the providence of God or the sovereignty of God, these big words that just talk about God's presence in our life even when we don't see it, and it was describing it. It's like reading Hebrew, in that you only understand the providence and the presence and the sovereignty of God in your life when he's invisible by reading it backwards. Because if you know anything about Hebrew, you read it backwards. You read it from right to left. And you can only pray, God, make haste to save me, and I rejoice while I wait for you, if you can read the story of your life backwards. If you know through experience and through the stories like this, that as the Proverbs writer says, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hands of God. He directs it wherever he wills. Or Ephesians 1, God works out all things according to the counsel of his will. You know, our Jewish neighbors celebrate the festival of Purim, P-U-R-I-M, which is right out of the story of Esther. And a lot of Christian traditions don't like the book of Esther because it doesn't mention God. Luther didn't like it, Calvin didn't like it. The Jews love it. And you know why? It's right up there with the Pentateuch. They celebrate it every year because it's a reminder that in the face of evil and almost being wiped out over and over and over again in the face of anti-Semitism, God is present. He will save them. He will overcome evil with good. It's not a bad festival for Christians to remember of what he has done for us in our lives, and that God will use the Esther-ness of our life, our failures and our virtues, and he will weave them together for good, not just for our own good, but for the good of our neighbors and our city. And I was sharing with somebody this week who was struggling with discouragement and thoughts and the lies that come into our hearts, where God feels like he's forsaken us or he's forgotten us or that we're not good enough. And that the ultimate example of reading backwards for the Christian is, of course, the cross of our King, who put a crown of thorns on his head so that the myrtle of God's forgiveness and grace can flow into our lives and into our world. And if you know anything about the history of the cross, it took 200 years for the church to adopt it as a symbol because it was so hideous and so shameful and so ugly, and it was used by the Caesars and the Xerxes of the world to humiliate people. And they tried 7 different symbols to use as a sign of the Christian faith, but they came back over and over and over and over again to the cross because that very simple symbol is the only thing that can keep you going in the January of your lives. Because it's a reminder of the great king who came down, who had no beauty for which we would look at him, very Esther-like. And that he died on our behalf, satisfying both the mercy and the justice of God. So the gates of the New Jerusalem will be open for you. And it's why Jesus gave us the symbol of another feast, right? So that when we come to his table, we look back at his death, but we look forward to the ultimate feast, where one day those gates will open and faith will be turned into sight, and we will be entering into the eternal Sabbath rest. This is the story of the ordinary life of Esther for the January of our lives. Now, I'm going to pray in a minute, but we're going to sing this prayer in a minute. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful broken roar between me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on your breast, may I hear thee say to me, I will pilot thee. When I'm at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar between me and the peaceful rest, may I hear you say to me, I will pilot thee. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word, for the honesty of it. And thank you for the way in which we can put ourselves in the story in a way that doesn't crush us, but that humbles us such that we can receive the justice and the mercy of Jesus on the cross. And I pray for those here this morning who are struggling with your absence, who are feeling distant from you, who are feeling abandoned by you. I pray that you will remind them through the story of Esther that you are with them, that you have never and will never forsake them. For the glory of Jesus Christ, and in his name we pray. Amen.
Yeehaw to you too, sir.